Number 1. Richard Ramirez. During the mid-1980s, residents of Los Angeles lived through one of the most terrifying crime waves in the history of the state. Night after night, a mysterious attacker entered homes while people slept, leaving behind scenes of unimaginable violence. The press eventually gave the unknown criminal a chilling nickname, the Night Stalker. The man behind the fear was Richard Ramirez, a drifter whose brutal crimes shocked the nation and forced millions of Californians to live in fear for months. Early life of Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez was born in 1960 in El Paso. His childhood was marked by instability, violence, and disturbing influences. Ramirez grew up in a household where physical punishment was common, and his father was known to have a violent temper. However, one of the most influential figures in Ramirez's life was his cousin Miguel Ramirez, a former soldier who had served in the Vietnam War. Miguel often told young Richard graphic stories about the war, including descriptions of violence he claimed to have committed overseas. According to later reports, he even showed Richard disturbing photographs from the conflict. These experiences deeply affected the young boy. As Ramirez grew older, he began displaying troubling behavior. He became fascinated with violent imagery and dark themes. During his teenage years, he also began using drugs and engaging in petty crimes. By the late 1970s, Ramirez had moved to California, drifting between cities and living a largely unstable life. He struggled with addiction and frequently slept in cheap hotels or abandoned buildings. But hidden behind his chaotic lifestyle was a growing pattern of violent fantasies. Those fantasies would soon turn into reality. The beginning of the Night Stalker attacks, the first known murder connected to Ramirez, occurred in June 1984 in Glassell Park. An elderly woman named Jenny Vinco was found murdered in her apartment after a violent, nighttime attack. At the time, investigators did not immediately realize that this crime would become the beginning of a deadly series. For nearly a year, Ramirez continued his attacks across different neighborhoods in Southern California. Unlike many serial killers who follow a consistent pattern, Ramirez's crimes appeared random. His victims ranged in age from young children to elderly adults. He broke into homes through unlocked doors or windows during the night. Once inside, he used a variety of weapons, including knives, guns, and blunt objects. Many victims were assaulted before being murdered. Because of the unpredictable nature of the attacks, residents across the region were terrified. The killer struck in multiple cities including Los Angeles, San Gabriel, and Whittier. Police struggled to connect the cases at first. The crimes occurred in different jurisdictions, and the methods used by the killer varied from attack to attack. But investigators eventually noticed several patterns. The attacks occurred almost exclusively at night, and the killer often entered homes silently while victims were asleep. Evidence from crime scenes suggested the same suspect was responsible. The media soon began referring to the unknown attacker as the Night Stalker. A city living in fear. As news of the crime spread, fear swept across Southern California. Residents began installing stronger locks, purchasing alarm systems, and even sleeping with weapons near their beds. Hardware stores reported selling out of security equipment as people attempted to protect their homes. Television news programs covered every development in the investigation. Each new attack increased the sense of panic. Parents kept children indoors after dark, and neighborhoods organized watch groups to patrol their streets. Despite these precautions, Ramirez continued his crimes. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Night Stalker case was the psychological element. At several crime scenes, Ramirez left symbols associated with satanic imagery, which intensified public fear. Investigators later determined that Ramirez had developed an obsession with occult themes and had begun identifying himself with Satanism. The combination of brutal violence and disturbing symbolism made the case even more shocking. The investigation intensifies. By the summer of 1985. Law enforcement agencies across California were working together to capture the Night Stalker. Detectives analyzed fingerprints, footprints, witness statements, and forensic evidence collected from numerous crime scenes. One crucial piece of evidence came from a shoe print left at one of the crime scenes. Investigators discovered that the print matched a rare type of sneaker known as an Avia shoe. Only a limited number of these shoes had been sold in the area, which helped narrow the search. Another breakthrough occurred when a survivor of one of Ramirez's attacks provided investigators with a description of the suspect. Witnesses also reported seeing a suspicious man fleeing from crime scenes. Then came the moment that changed the entire investigation. In August 1985, Ramirez attacked a couple in Mission Viejo. During the attack, the survivors managed to observe several details about the suspect and the vehicle he used to escape. The vehicle was later found abandoned, allowing investigators to recover fingerprints. Those fingerprints were quickly matched to Richard Ramirez, who already had a criminal record. The identity of the Night Stalker was finally known. The capture of the Night Stalker on August 31, 1985, Ramirez returned to Los Angeles after traveling outside the city. By that time, his photograph had been widely distributed through newspapers and television broadcasts. As he walked through a neighborhood in East Los Angeles, several residents recognized him. What happened next was extraordinary. Instead of waiting for police, members of the community chased Ramirez through the streets. He attempted to flee, jumping fences and running through yards, but residents continued pursuing him. Eventually, a group of citizens managed to capture him and hold him until police arrived. When officers took Ramirez into custody, the Night Stalker's reign of terror finally came to an end. The trial of Richard Ramirez began in 1988 and quickly became one of the most sensational criminal trials in California history. Prosecutors presented evidence linking Ramirez to 13 murders, multiple assaults, and numerous burglaries. Survivors of his attacks testified about the terrifying events they had endured. Forensic evidence, including fingerprints and shoeprints, connected Ramirez to multiple crime scenes. Throughout the trial, Ramirez displayed bizarre behavior in court. At one point he raised his hand to reveal a pentagram symbol drawn on his palm, shouting phrases associated with Satanism. His actions shocked spectators and reinforced the public perception of him as a deeply disturbed individual. Despite his attempts to create a dramatic spectacle, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Conviction and sentence in 1989. The jury found Richard Ramirez guilty of multiple counts of murder and other serious crimes. The judge sentenced him to death. Ramirez was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he remained on death row for more than 2 decades. During that time, he continued to attract attention from the media and from individuals fascinated by his crimes. However, he never faced execution. In 2013, Richard Ramirez died from complications related to cancer while still in prison. The legacy of the Night Stalker. The Night Stalker case left a lasting impact on California. For months, millions of residents lived in fear that the killer might strike again. The crimes changed how people thought about home security and personal safety. Law enforcement agencies also improved coordination between jurisdictions as a result of the investigation. The Night Stalker case demonstrated how serial criminals could operate across multiple cities, making cooperation between police departments essential. Today, the story of Richard Ramirez remains one of the most chilling chapters in California's criminal history. The events of 1984 and 1985 serve as a reminder that even in crowded cities filled with millions of people, a single individual can create fear on a massive scale. For the families of the victims, the tragedy will never be forgotten. And for California, the name Richard Ramirez will forever be associated with the dark nights when the Night Stalker walked the streets. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 2. Charles Manson. In the summer of 1969, the glamorous hills above Los Angeles were home to some of the most famous people in the entertainment industry. Actors, musicians, and filmmakers lived in secluded homes overlooking the city, enjoying the luxury and privacy that Hollywood wealth could provide. But during one horrifying weekend in August 1969, a series of murders shattered that illusion of safety and stunned the entire United States. The crimes would become known as the Manson family murders, orchestrated by a charismatic yet deeply disturbed cult leader named Charles Manson. The brutality of the killings, the bizarre motives behind them, and the shocking identities of those involved made the case one of the most infamous in American criminal history. The rise of Charles Manson. Charles Manson was born in 1934 in Cincinnati. His childhood was marked by instability, neglect, and repeated encounters with the criminal justice system. His mother struggled with alcoholism and frequently left him in the care of relatives or strangers. By his teenage years, Manson had already begun committing crimes, including theft and burglary. He spent much of his early life moving between juvenile detention centers and prisons. During his time in prison, Manson developed an intense interest in manipulation and psychological control. He studied various philosophies, religious teachings, and techniques that he later used to influence others. When he was released from prison in 1967, Manson moved to San Francisco just as the city was becoming the center of the counterculture movement known as the Summer of Love. Thousands of young people had traveled there seeking freedom, community, and spiritual exploration. Manson quickly realized that he could take advantage of this environment. The creation of the Manson family, Manson began attracting followers, mostly young women, searching for purpose or belonging. Using charm, manipulation, and psychological pressure, he convinced them that he possessed special spiritual knowledge. Over time, this group became known as the Manson family. The followers lived together in communal settings, often moving between locations around California. Eventually, the group settled at Spahn Ranch, an isolated property outside Los Angeles. At the ranch, Manson strengthened his control over the group. He used drugs, particularly LSD, to influence his followers' perceptions and reinforce his authority. Many members came to believe that Manson possessed supernatural insight and that his instructions must be obeyed without question. Manson also developed a bizarre belief about an approaching race war in America. He called this imagined conflict helter-skelter, a term he borrowed from the song Helter Skelter from the Beatles. According to Manson's twisted interpretation, society was on the verge of violent collapse. He believed that a series of shocking murders could accelerate the coming chaos. The Tate murders on the night of August 8, 1969. Manson instructed several of his followers to carry out a deadly mission. The group included Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. Their target was a house located at 10,050 Cielo Drive in the hills above Los Angeles. The house was being rented by actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant at the time. Also staying at the home that night were several guests, including celebrity hairdresser Jay Sebring, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and writer Wojciech Frykowski. In the early hours of August 9th, the killers entered the property. What followed was an act of brutal violence that shocked even experienced investigators. All 5 people inside the home were murdered. The attackers left disturbing messages written in blood on the walls, further deepening the mystery surrounding the crime. When police discovered the bodies later that morning, the shocking scene quickly made national headlines. The LaBianca murders. The horror did not end there. The following night, August 10th, Manson himself accompanied several followers to another home in Los Angeles. This time, the victims were grocery store executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary LaBianca. After entering the house, Manson tied up the couple and then left the scene, instructing his followers to carry out the murders. The victims were later found dead in their home, with more cryptic messages written at the scene. At first, investigators did not realize that the Tate and LaBianca murders were connected, but as evidence emerged, the shocking truth began to unfold. The investigation and arrests for several months, the murders remained unsolved. Then, an unexpected break in the case occurred. One of Manson's followers, Susan Atkins, boasted about the murders while in jail on unrelated charges. Another inmate reported her statements to authorities. This information led investigators to examine the activities of the Manson family at Spahn Ranch. Soon afterward, police arrested several members of the group. Eventually, Charles Manson himself was also arrested and charged with orchestrating the murders. The trial began in 1970 and quickly became one of the most sensational court cases in American history. The bizarre behavior of Manson and his followers shocked observers. Several members of the Manson family appeared in court with shaved heads and carved symbols on their foreheads as signs of loyalty to their leader. Manson himself frequently disrupted the proceedings with strange outbursts. Despite the unusual atmosphere, prosecutors presented strong evidence that Manson had directed his followers to commit the murders, although he had not personally carried out the killings. The court concluded that he was responsible for planning and ordering them. Conviction and sentence in 1971. Charles Manson and several of his followers were convicted of multiple counts of murder. They were initially sentenced to death. However, when California temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1972, their sentences were changed to life imprisonment. Manson spent the remainder of his life in prison, becoming one of the most notorious criminals in American history. He died in 2017 while incarcerated at California State Prison. The legacy of the Manson murders, the Manson family murders, marked a turning point in American culture. The crimes shocked the nation and symbolized the darker side of the 1960s counterculture movement. What had once been associated with peace and freedom suddenly became linked to violence and manipulation. The case also revealed how charismatic individuals can exploit vulnerable followers and persuade them to commit terrible acts. More than 50 years later, the names of Charles Manson and the victims of the Tate-LaBianca murders remain permanently linked in the history of California crime. For many people, the case continues to represent one of the most disturbing examples of how influence, ideology, and violence can combine to produce tragedy on an unimaginable scale. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 3. Joseph James DeAngelo. During the 1970s and 1980s, communities across California were haunted by a criminal whose crimes seemed almost impossible to stop. Residents in quiet suburban neighborhoods began reporting nighttime attacks that left entire communities terrified. The attacker broke into homes silently, often entering through windows or sliding doors, after carefully studying his victims for days or even weeks. The man responsible for this decades-long wave of terror was eventually identified as Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who managed to evade capture for more than 40 years. His crimes stretched across numerous cities in California, including Sacramento, Visalia, and Irvine, leaving behind a trail of fear that would last for decades. Joseph James DeAngelo was born in 1945 in Bath. His father served in the military, and DeAngelo spent part of his childhood living overseas in Germany before eventually returning to the United States. By the time his family settled in California, DeAngelo was entering adolescence. People who knew him during his youth later described him as quiet and serious, but there were also signs of anger and emotional instability. Some reports suggested that he experienced trauma during childhood that may have influenced his later behavior, though the exact details remain uncertain. As a young adult, DeAngelo attended California State University, Sacramento, where he studied criminal justice. After completing his education, he joined law enforcement and worked as a police officer in several California communities during the early 1970s. To the people around him, DeAngelo appeared to be a typical officer performing his duties. He wore the uniform, patrolled neighborhoods, and presented himself as someone responsible for protecting the public. But while living this seemingly ordinary life, he was secretly developing one of the most disturbing criminal careers in American history. The earliest crimes connected to DeAngelo occurred in the mid-1970s in the city of Visalia, California. During that time, a series of burglaries plagued the community. A mysterious intruder broke into homes at night, stealing small personal items and creating an atmosphere of anxiety among residents. The offender became known as the Visalia Killer. These break-ins appeared unusual because the burglar often spent long periods inside homes, sometimes moving objects around or taking items that seemed to have little monetary value. Investigators suspected the offender might be studying his victims or simply enjoying the act of invading their private spaces. Although police pursued numerous leads, the identity of the burglar remained unknown. By 1976, the crimes escalated dramatically. In Sacramento, a series of nighttime attacks began targeting women in their homes. The attacker entered quietly while victims slept, using threats and weapons to control them. He often bound victims and displayed extreme planning and patience. The offender became known as the East Area Rapist. These attacks terrified entire neighborhoods. Residents began installing new locks, security lights, and alarm systems. Some families even slept with weapons nearby, fearing the attacker might break into their homes during the night. Despite increased police patrols and community vigilance, the crimes continued. One of the most disturbing aspects of the attacks was the offender's methodical approach. He frequently stalked victims beforehand, watching their routines and identifying weaknesses in their home security. Sometimes he made phone calls to victims before or after the crimes, whispering threats that intensified their fear. As the attacks continued, investigators realized they were dealing with a highly organized offender who understood police procedures and forensic techniques. The crimes spread across several counties, making coordination between law enforcement agencies extremely difficult. Then, in the late 1970s, the violence escalated once again. the attacker began committing murders. In 1979 and the early 1980s, several couples were found murdered in their homes in Southern California. The killer used similar methods of entry and control that had been seen in the earlier attacks. Investigators eventually concluded that the East Area rapist and the murderer responsible for these killings were the same person. The suspect received a new name in the media, the Golden State Killer. The crimes stretched across numerous communities, including Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Irvine. Each crime scene left behind very little evidence, and the killer seemed to disappear without a trace. For years, investigators pursued countless leads but could not identify the suspect. Eventually, the crimes stopped. By the mid-1980s, the Golden State Killer seemed to vanish completely. Some investigators believed the offender may have died, moved away, or been imprisoned for unrelated crimes, but the case was far from forgotten. Decades later, advances in forensic science provided new hope. Investigators had preserved DNA evidence from several crime scenes, but for many years there was no matching profile in criminal databases. However, in the 2010s, a new investigative technique emerged that would change the course of the case. This method involved genetic genealogy, a process that uses public DNA databases to identify possible relatives of an unknown suspect. In 2018, investigators uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile into a genealogy database and began searching for potential family connections. The results led them to a family tree that eventually pointed toward Joseph James DeAngelo. Detectives began secretly monitoring DeAngelo, collecting discarded DNA from items he threw away. When forensic analysts compared that DNA to evidence from the crime scenes, the match was undeniable. After more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer had finally been identified. On April 24, 2018, police arrested DeAngelo outside his home in Citrus Heights. Neighbors were stunned. Many described him as a quiet, elderly man who had lived in the neighborhood for years without drawing attention. Few could believe that the man who once terrorized California had been living an ordinary suburban life for decades. The arrest quickly became international news. For the victims and their families, it was a moment they had waited for most of their lives. In 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo appeared in court and pleaded guilty to numerous charges including murder and kidnapping. Because of his age and the legal agreements reached with prosecutors, he was sentenced to multiple life sentences instead of receiving the death penalty. During the court proceedings, many survivors and family members of victims delivered emotional statements, describing the trauma that had affected their lives for decades. For them, the crimes had never truly ended. The Golden State Killer case became one of the most famous examples of how modern forensic technology can solve cold cases that once seemed impossible. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of persistence among law enforcement officers who refused to give up, even after decades without answers. Today, Joseph James DeAngelo remains imprisoned for the crimes that once spread fear across California. The story of the Golden State Killer continues to fascinate investigators, historians, and the public because it represents both the darkness of human behavior and the remarkable ability of science and determination to bring long-awaited justice. For many Californians, the arrest of DeAngelo closed a chapter that had remained open for more than 40 years, but the memory of those crimes and the lives forever changed by them will never be forgotten. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 4. Edmund Kemper. In the early 1970s, the quiet coastal communities around Santa Cruz were known for their beaches, forests, and relaxed college town atmosphere. The area attracted students, travelers, and young people drawn to the natural beauty of California's central coast. But during this period, a series of disappearances began to alarm residents. Young women, many of them college students, vanished while hitchhiking along local roads. At the time, hitchhiking was a common way for students to travel between campuses and nearby towns. Few people imagined that accepting a ride from a stranger could lead to tragedy. The man responsible for these crimes was Edmund Kemper, a towering figure whose intelligence and disturbing psychology would later fascinate criminologists and investigators for decades. Edmund Kemper was born in 1948 in Burbank. From an early age, his childhood was troubled and filled with conflict. Kemper later described having a deeply strained relationship with his mother, Clarnell Kemper, whom he claimed was emotionally abusive and highly critical. His parents divorced when he was young, and Kemper spent much of his youth feeling isolated and resentful. By the time he reached adolescence, disturbing patterns of behavior had already appeared. Kemper admitted that he had developed violent fantasies involving control and domination. He also displayed cruelty toward animals, which many experts later recognized as an early warning sign of severe psychological problems. At just 15 years old, Kemper committed a shocking crime. In 1964, he murdered his grandparents at their home in North Fork. The crime stunned the local community and led to Kemper's arrest. Psychiatrists who evaluated him determined that he suffered from serious mental health issues, and he was committed to Atascadero State Hospital, a facility that treated mentally ill criminal offenders. During his years at the hospital, Kemper appeared to cooperate with doctors and therapists. He was intelligent, articulate, and capable of discussing his behavior in a calm and analytical manner. Eventually, psychiatrists concluded that he had made progress in treatment. In 1969, at the age of 21, Kemper was released. The decision would later be viewed as a tragic mistake. After leaving the hospital, Kemper moved to Santa Cruz, where his mother was living. At the time, the area was home to the University of California, Santa Cruz, which brought many young students to the region. Kemper found work and attempted to live a normal life, but the violent fantasies that had haunted him since childhood had not disappeared. In 1972, those fantasies began turning into reality. Kemper started picking up young women who were hitchhiking near the university campus, because hitchhiking was common among students. The victims had little reason to suspect that the tall, soft-spoken driver offering them a ride posed any danger. Once the victims were inside his car, however, the situation changed. Kemper would drive to isolated locations where he murdered them. Over the next several months, multiple young women disappeared around Santa Cruz. Their bodies were later discovered in remote areas, and investigators began to suspect a serial killer was operating in the region. The crimes created widespread fear. Students became increasingly cautious about traveling alone, and local authorities urged residents to avoid hitchhiking. But despite these warnings, the killer continued his attacks. One of the most disturbing aspects of Kemper's behavior was how he interacted with law enforcement during this time. Kemper frequently visited a local bar known as the Jury Room, where police officers gathered after work. He became friendly with several officers and often engaged them in conversations about the ongoing murder investigation. The officers had no idea that the man sitting with them was the very killer they were searching for. Kemper's intelligence and ability to appear calm made him particularly dangerous. He understood investigative techniques and carefully planned his actions to avoid suspicion. Between 1972 and 1973, Kemper murdered 6 young women in the Santa Cruz area. Because many of the victims were college students, the media began referring to the unknown killer as the co-ed killer. But Kemper's crimes did not stop there. In April 1973, the violence escalated to an even more shocking level. After years of resentment and anger toward his mother, Kemper murdered Clarnell Kemper in their home in Santa Cruz. The crime was particularly brutal and appeared to be the result of long-suppressed rage. Soon afterward, Kemper also murdered one of his mother's friends who had come to visit the house. At that point, Kemper seemed to realize that his crimes could not continue indefinitely. Instead of attempting to hide, he made a surprising decision. He left California and drove east until he reached Pueblo. While there, he contacted police and confessed to the murders. At first, investigators in California did not believe the call. The man on the phone calmly claimed responsibility for multiple murders, but detectives initially thought it might be a prank. Eventually, however, the details he provided convinced them that he was telling the truth. Kemper was arrested and returned to California to face trial. The case shocked the nation, not only because of the brutal crimes, but also because of Kemper's demeanor. During interviews and court proceedings, he appeared calm, intelligent, and capable of discussing his actions with disturbing clarity. Psychologists who studied him were fascinated by his ability to analyze his own behavior. Kemper openly described the violent fantasies and psychological motivations behind his crimes. In 1973, he was convicted of multiple counts of murder. Rather than receiving the death penalty, Kemper was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was eventually incarcerated at California Medical Facility, where he has remained for decades. Over the years, Kemper has participated in numerous interviews with law enforcement officials and psychologists. His detailed explanations of his crimes have been used to help investigators understand the behavior of serial offenders. Despite this cooperation, the brutality of his actions continues to disturb those who study the case. The Santa Cruz murders remain one of the darkest chapters in California's criminal history. For the families of the victims, the tragedy left permanent scars that no amount of time can erase. The story of Edmund Kemper also serves as a reminder of how complex and dangerous human psychology can be. An individual who appeared intelligent, cooperative, and even friendly was secretly responsible for a series of horrific crimes that terrorized an entire community. For decades, the case has been studied by criminologists, psychologists, and investigators seeking to understand the minds of violent offenders. But for the people of Santa Cruz, the memory of those years when young women vanished along quiet coastal roads is something that will never be forgotten. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 5. Richard Chase. In the late 1970s, the quiet neighborhoods of Sacramento were shaken by a series of crimes, so disturbing that they stunned even experienced investigators. Residents had grown accustomed to the peaceful rhythms of suburban life, where families left their doors unlocked and children played freely outside. But beginning in 1977, something strange and terrifying began to unfold. Police were called to investigate several bizarre incidents involving animal mutilations, break-ins, and acts that appeared deeply irrational. At first, authorities believed these events might be isolated acts committed by troubled individuals. What they did not yet realize was that a dangerously unstable man was slowly descending into violent madness. That man was Richard Chase. Richard Trenton Chase was born in 1950 in Santa Clara. From an early age, he displayed signs of severe psychological disturbance. As a teenager, he struggled with paranoia, delusions, and unusual behavior that concerned those around him. By his early 20s, Chase was suffering from serious mental illness. Doctors eventually diagnosed him with schizophrenia, a condition that caused him to experience hallucinations and deeply irrational beliefs. Chase became convinced that his body was deteriorating from the inside. He believed his blood was turning into powder and that his heart occasionally stopped beating. Because of these delusions, he developed a bizarre belief that drinking blood could keep him alive. These disturbing thoughts soon turned into dangerous behavior. During the mid-1970s, Chase was repeatedly hospitalized for psychiatric treatment. At one point, he was admitted to a Atascadero State Hospital, the same institution that had once treated another infamous California killer, Edmund Kemper. Doctors recognized that Chase was suffering from severe mental illness and required long-term care. However, after several years, he was deemed stable enough to be released under supervision. The decision would later prove tragic. After leaving the hospital, Chase returned to Sacramento and began living alone. His mental condition quickly deteriorated again. He stopped taking medication and resumed experiencing intense delusions. Neighbors later recalled seeing him behaving strangely, wandering through neighborhoods late at night and appearing increasingly disoriented. At first, the crimes associated with Chase seemed bizarre but not necessarily connected to murder. In several incidents, he was caught breaking into homes, stealing food, and leaving behind unusual scenes. Sometimes he removed items from refrigerators or scattered belongings around houses without stealing anything valuable. Investigators later learned that Chase had a strange belief about locked doors. He believed that if a house door was locked, it meant he was not allowed to enter. But if the door was unlocked, he believed it was an invitation to come inside. This belief would soon lead to tragedy. On December 29, 1977, Chase committed his first confirmed murder. The victim was Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old father who was unloading groceries from his car outside his home in Sacramento. Chase drove past Griffin, then suddenly fired a gun through the window of his vehicle, killing him. The attack appeared completely random. Police had no clear motive, and the lack of witnesses made the investigation difficult. Less than a month later, the situation became far more horrifying. On January 23, 1978, Chase entered the home of Teresa Wallin, a pregnant woman living in Sacramento. Her front door was unlocked. Inside the house, Chase carried out a brutal attack that shocked investigators when the crime scene was discovered. The level of violence and the bizarre evidence left behind indicated that the killer was deeply disturbed. Detectives soon realized they were dealing with an extremely dangerous individual. Just 4 days later, Chase struck again. On January 27, 1978, he entered another home in Sacramento where several people were present. During the attack, he murdered Evelyn Mirith, along with 2 other individuals in the house. A child present in the home was kidnapped but later found alive. The brutal nature of the murders created widespread panic across Sacramento. Residents who had once felt safe leaving doors unlocked suddenly began locking every window and door in their homes. Police warned the public about the possibility that a dangerous intruder was entering houses at random. Investigators worked quickly to identify the suspect. One of the key breakthroughs came from forensic evidence found at the crime scenes. Fingerprints collected during the investigation were entered into law enforcement databases. The results pointed directly to Richard Chase, who already had a history of mental health treatment and previous encounters with police. When authorities searched Chase's apartment, they discovered evidence linking him to the murders. The condition of the apartment itself also shocked investigators, revealing the depth of his psychological instability. In 1978, Richard Chase was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The trial that followed drew enormous attention because of the bizarre and disturbing nature of the crimes. Prosecutors presented evidence demonstrating Chase's involvement in the killings and the unusual behavior surrounding the crimes. However, the case also raised difficult questions about mental illness. Chase's defense argued that he was legally insane at the time of the murders and could not fully understand his actions. Psychiatrists testified about his severe schizophrenia and long history of delusional thinking. Despite these arguments, the jury ultimately concluded that Chase understood the nature of his actions and could be held responsible. He was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. Chase was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he was placed on death row. However, he would never face execution. In 1980, Richard Chase died in prison after an apparent overdose of medication. His death brought an end to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in California history. The crimes of Richard Chase left a lasting impact on Sacramento. For many residents, the realization that a severely disturbed individual had been able to enter homes simply because doors were unlocked was deeply unsettling. After the murders, security habits across the city changed dramatically. People who had once trusted their neighborhoods began locking doors and windows as a basic precaution. Today, the story of the Vampire of Sacramento remains one of the most chilling cases ever studied by criminologists and psychologists. It highlights the tragic consequences that can occur when severe mental illness goes untreated and when dangerous individuals fall through gaps in the mental health system. For the families of the victims, the case represents a painful reminder of lives lost to a crime spree that lasted only a short time, but left permanent scars on an entire community. And for Sacramento, the memory of those dark weeks in 1977 and 1978 continues to echo as one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of California crime. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.